advised. The opinions and views of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
The whole nation has been preoccupied this past 2 weeks with the Bangsamoro issue, the syntax issue, and maybe other issues. But what we wanted to ensure that you do not forget, that we all keep in mind, is the most recent move by Meralco to increase our rates again. And this time, they announced, and it was not even a petition for approval or for hearing, but they announced that they would increase. They announced in particular to 90,000 Meralco customers that they would be increasing the bill deposit, and the whole 5 million customer base of Meralco was taken aback. ERC was taken aback apparently. Everybody was shocked, and they said, "What? Ano na naman itong increase na to?" Ano? And everybody had to go back and do research on what this bill deposit is. We all know about the meter deposit, yung metro natin, but yung bill deposit, ano? So we finally had to spend days and weeks to research this, and one man on top of this researching and study of this bill deposit is with us today, a frequent guest of ours when it comes to electricity, Mr. Butchunya, a consumer advocate, power consumer advocate, and we'll allow him to explain to us what this bill deposit is, what it means, what kind of increase we're facing. From what we were discussing just before we started the program, we are probably faced, those who have billings today of maybe, let's say, average of, put it at 3,000, can expect maybe 3,002 of additional bill deposit billing and of spread, even if they spread it over a year. Is that just? Is that fair? Is that correct? So, Butch, magandang araw, and start shooting.
Kamendong, again, thank you for having me here again, and it's always a pleasure to be on your program and to be able to address your viewers and listeners. Tama ka nga, Kamendong, that everybody was taken by surprise, but I am doubly surprised because if ERC itself was surprised by that increase in the deposit, then there is really something wrong with our system. Because
first, explain, what is that deposit? Because maraming text sa akin sa radio program ko, sa DWAD, ano? Ano ba ito? May na-receive kami. Kayo ba naka-receive nito? Bakit hindi lahat sabay-sabay? At ano ba ito?
Ang konsepto Kamendong ng bill deposit, actually, matagal nang ginagawa yan. Even before it was formalized or captured in the Magna Carta that was issued by ERC in 2004, I am sure you and I had already been charged for a bill deposit. Pag nag-apply ka ng connection ng service with Meralco, among the other fees that you had to pay, there were essentially two distinct and separate fees pertaining to this. Yung isa is the bill deposit, and the bill deposit is computed on the basis of what is your estimated 1 month consumption. The concept ng bill deposit is that if you default, kukunin na lang yan ng utility yan. And this is not just Meralco, these are all the utilities. Kukunin na lang nila yung deposit na yan, i-apply sa deficiency mo, sa delinquency mo, and then they are covered. They are protected. No?
Oh.
Conceptually, it protects everybody. Kasi kung mayroon nga naman na mataas na rate of default, marami yung mga hindi magbabayad, the rest of the customers are going to be affected. No? The other standard na sinisingil nila when you apply was the meter deposit. Fortunately for the customers, and these are all the customers, including Meralco, in the Magna Carta in 2004, and at the proddings and at the exhortations of various consumer groups, and in fact, it came from a Supreme Court decision eventually, sinabihan na yung utilities, huwag kayong humingi ng meter deposit. Ano ang dahilan nito? Ang dahilan is, if you hold yourself out as a service provider for the distribution of electricity, it is presumed that you have the capital and the wherewithal to be able to purchase the equipment that will be needed for providing the service. So why should you be requiring your customers to pay the meter? That's why in the Magna Carta of 2004, one of the supposed consumer benefit highlights is that the meter deposit was to be returned in its entirety. But mind you, in the 2011 annual report of Meralco, they're still holding on to 2.2 billion pesos worth of meter deposits. Those amounts have to be returned to the customers. Now, to go back to the bill deposit, under the Magna Carta in 2004, there is a provision that says the bill deposit has to be assessed on an annual basis, and if the customer, there is a variation of the customer's consumption within the month, plus or minus a certain percentage, vis-a-vis the original nominated consumption that he indicated in the application, then the bill deposit is going to be adjusted accordingly pertaining to the change, whether plus or minus. That is why there's also a provision in the Magna Carta that says that after 3 years, customers that have not been delinquent at all, that have paid their power bills religiously, they are entitled to a refund of the customer,
Okay, let's
the
take
bill deposit.
a brief break. No? So, every connection before it is installed by the
Yes.
distribution utility, in this case Meralco, hihingan ka ng meter deposit na sinasabi ng Magna Carta, dapat ibalik na lahat yan,
Ibalik.
pero meron pang hinahawakan ng Meralco.
And
Okay.
after Magna Carta, hindi na dapat singilin yun.
Hindi
So
na dapat
anybody who sees a meter application that connection application that shows a meter deposit, that's illegal.
Okay. So, pangalawa, yung bill deposit, sabi, after the Magna Carta, i-adjust yan ayon doon sa konsumo
mo.
yung huling konsumo.
Aha.
Pataas o pababa.
Aha.
Okay, so those 2 points. And then, did you mention yung after 3 years of faithfully and dutifully and paying on time, a customer can demand for a reimbursement or refund. Tama ba? Refund
Yes.
is the right word, no?
Actually refund, but actually Kamentong, that is just an extension, I think, of the logic that should guide this particular cost component. In the first place, ang pinanggagalingan nito is the so-called Magna Carta. If it is the Magna Carta for consumers, Kamentong, it should be a document of liberation and a document of freedoms for the consumers. What do you think is the assumption kung pag nagpapakonekta ka, hinihingan ka ng deposit? It can only come from the assumption na delinquente ka, na hindi ka magbabayad. Do you think that is a reasonable assumption under a so-called Magna Carta for consumers?
At saka ang record, the fact of the matter
Yes.
is, in actual practice, wala man lang mga
25%.
25% i-assume natin na nagkakaroon ng delinquency. At hindi ibig sabihin hindi nagbabayad. Ibig
Exactly.
sabihin, nadidelay na isang linggo, na ibig sabihin na-issue ng notice of disconnection. That's all it means.
Well,
Diba?
that is also another area where we have certain issues with the regulator and with the utility. But to go back Kamentong doon sa sa bill deposit, ang amin sanang suggestion, and I wrote this down to the chairman of the Energy Regulatory Commission, it was delivered last October 17. Sabi ko, just to be consistent with the spirit of the Magna Carta, let us proceed on the assumption that customers are credit worthy. So in other words, you don't demand a deposit from
And
them.
sa totoo lang, the majority naman is credit
75% is credit worthy. After 1 year, if his performance is such that he loses the credit worthiness at the time of application, that's the time that you ask for a deposit from him.
Unang beses. So,
Why? Historically, it has already been shown by Meralco itself. Sabi ni Miss Ivana de la Peña, 90,000 customers. Sabi ni Miss Lumotan, 110,000 customers in a month. So if you total that up for the 12 months, na may delinquency, may experience.
Hindi ibig sabihin hindi nagbayad.
Hindi nagbayad.
Nahuhuli lang.
In fact, that's the point, Kamentong, why I was saying, even in terms of the basis or the criteria for asking a deposit, dalawa kasi ang measure. One is you get disconnected. The other is you get 3 notices. Ang point ko, even if you get 30 notices or 6 notices, provided you do not get disconnected, that means you paid before the expiration of the grace period. So, why should you be asked to make that kind of a deposit? So if there is going to be an application, it should be applied to those who had actually been disconnected. So if you look at the total amount of bill deposit that is the subject of all this talk right now, according to the annual report of Meralco for the year 2011, the total amount is 26.4 billion pesos. That's the amount of bill deposits that you and I made, and in aggregate, Meralco is holding on to right now. If you impute, if you apply the 25% delinquency, something like 5.2 billion of that should be sufficient to answer for the 25% delinquent accounts.
And remember, that doesn't mean na hindi nagbayad yan. Yung 5.2 billion
of course,
pesos, pumasok pa rin yun eventually.
Because you will not be reconnected unless you pay
Precisely.
the delinquency. So, in effect, the 5.2 billion, like I said, becomes a theoretically inexhaustible
Hindi
funds
maubos yan.
that replenishes itself.
Wait, this is an important point. The threat of disconnection itself is enough
Yes.
to make people pay up sooner or later unless they no longer want to be connected to the electricity grid, di ba?
In fact, Kamentong, if what you mention now, I'm going to use that as the handle to go into the interest rate, yung kawawang household threatened by disconnection will go to a Bombay at hihiram ng 20% 5.6 just to be able to pay at hindi siya ma-disconnect. Because can you imagine the social stigma of your house, the only one not having any lights, and of course, the untold inconvenience of having to live without electricity.
And at this point, I'd also like to insert, because this was missed even by your paper, doon sa Magna Carta, nakadefine affordable.
Oh, yes.
Efficient, reliable, regular, etc., and affordable electricity. Somebody has to define that affordability, even for the poor, di ba?
Well, actually, if you're looking for a definition of what is affordable conceptually, wag na tayong lumayo. We go to the Supreme Court decision of Justice
2003,
Renato
no?
Puno in 2002 and 2003, where it was very clearly laid down what will be the criteria for the charges that the utility is going to collect from us, in this case, particularly Meralco. Tragically, for the consumers and the customers of Meralco, right after yung decision na yon, ERC adopted what is now the performance-based regulation, PBR, which in effect shifted the regulatory regime away from the clarity of the Supreme Court decision into the murky waters of what is now PBR.
In other words, in Filipino or in Tagalog, pinoteksyonan na tayo ng Supreme Court. Nung ginawa ng Supreme Court yun ni Puno, sinadya ng ERC na paikutan ito para itaas ang sigil. At yung inapirmahan na ng Supreme Court, kanilang in English, ma-deny, or ma-negate. Napakasalbahe nun, di ba?
Ma-negate yung gains that
for the consumer.
For the consumers.
And the only word I can think of, salbahe. Salbahe ang ERC doon.
Totoo yan. I cannot but confirm it. Alam mo, Kamentong, doon sa Magna Carta, I have read it a number of times, and every time I read it, para akong, nakakadismaya at nakakasuka na basahin that they presume to give it a title na Magna Carta for consumers, but you read through it, para tayong under the yoke of the utilities with the complicity of the ERC that issued the Magna Carta. If we are going to look for a Magna Carta for consumers as far as the electricity industry is concerned, I would suggest that we go back to that decision of Justice Renato Puno. He was not the Chief Justice at that time, where at the opening of his ponencia, he said the right to electricity is a right that should be elevated to the level of the right to liberty and the right to life. It is a right to the supply of electricity and to be reasonably charged for it. Of course, Justice Puno expressed it in far more elegant language, but the thrust of that particular paragraph is, first, it is elevated to that level of a right, and second, that we are entitled to reliable and stable supply, and we have the right to demand a reasonable rate to be reasonably charged for it. That is the language, that is the sentiment, the concept that no matter how hard I look at the Magna Carta, supposedly, kuno. I simply don't find it there.
Madalas naman yung mga pangalan na binibigay sa batas ay kabaliktaran nung ipinapasok doon. Electric Power Industry Reform Act na nagbigay ng pagtaas ng doble ng kuryente natin. Ngayon, you have a Magna Carta, a Bill of Rights. Not of the consumer pala, but of
the utilities.
Of the
Kasi
distribution
ang nakalagay doon, pumalyo ka sa pagbayad, ganito ang gagawin sa'yo. Hindi ka nakapag-file ng ganito, ganitong gagawin sa'yo. In fact, there is a whole chapter or a whole provision under the obligations of the customers which says you have the obligation to pay, you have the obligation to see to it that the meter is protected from the elements. Excuse me, why in heaven's name should it be my obligation to see to it that the equipment and the facilities of the service provider ay dapat puprotectionan ko? There are many things there that need really a serious second look. But, Kamentong, in the original version of the Magna Carta, if we're going to talk about the treatment of the 26.4 billion peso bill deposit account, in the original provision, it said the utility is going to pay the customer for the bill deposit an interest aligned or equivalent to the interest in the computation of the weighted average cost of capital.
Okay, before you go into that, you have to explain the weighted average cost of capital. So yung capital, yung interest ng capital ng Meralco or other distribution utilities, tayong nagbabayad.
Supposedly.
Sa atin.
I use the word supposedly pertaining to the supposed capital that is invested by Meralco. Ang computation Kamentong ng weighted average cost of capital is they arrive at the percentage, in this case 14.75% on the basis of different variables. And the variables are gross domestic product, consumption price index, CPI of the United States, foreign exchange rate.
Bakit ang United States?
I really don't know. Up to now, I haven't figured it out.
Kung ganyan, consumer price index ng US, di lahat ng mga negosyante sa Pilipinas, yun ang dapat gamitin.
Actually, now that you mention it, my simplistic view of it is, sa United States, Kamentong, ang kuryente is 12 cents per kilowatt hour.
That's right.
Dito sa atin, 44 cents per kilowatt hour. If you are using US indices, then our price should be 12 cents per kilowatt hour, 12 US cents per kilowatt hour.
But the logical conclusion we can draw from this is that this was designed for US investors na sinasabi. Kasi consumer price index ng US ang gagamitin eh.
Posible. I must apologize. I'm not really that familiar with CPI. You're more at home with that kind of a
But I
discussion.
think the point here is that those who wrote this were not considering Philippine conditions. They're considering US conditions, and that is really
Well, anyway, to go back to the WACC, Kamentong, there are 2 points here to keep in mind. First, the weighted average cost of capital, when it was still called return on rate base under RORB, that was the rate of return that was capped at 12%. The law said, and even the Supreme Court decision of Justice Puno said, the utility cannot go beyond 12% per annum in terms of recovery on return on rate base. Maximum 12%. Now, what the EPIRA said and what the performance-based regulation said is, okay, you impute several variables, even if you come up with more than 12%, it's okay, provided you take into account all these variables. And that is why now, they have come up with a 14.75% weighted average cost of capital. WACC simply means that the 14.75% is going to be applied to the regulatory asset base, the RAB, which is the equivalent of the rate base under RORB. And
the rate base is the
all the assets,
all the capital, equipment, etc.
and the assets
is required to deliver the service.
To deliver the service. And mind you, the asset base of Meralco during return on rate base, the regime of return on rate base was about 60 billion or 70 billion. When we went into rate unbundling in about 1998 or 1997, it went up to about 80 billion. And under PBR, it progressively increased from 122 to 127, currently to 113. Now, let me point out, reading the annual report of Meralco, the equity, the consumer, owner's equity in Meralco is 63 billion pesos. The asset base on which the 14.75% is applied because of the different increases from appraisal increase and from the capital expense that had been collected from us over the years is already 130 billion. Can you imagine the difference if even if you stay at 14.75%, but if you apply the 14.75% to the 63 billion owners, investors' equity in Meralco, rather than the regulatory asset base of 130 billion, the current 19.7 billion pesos that we pay for as weighted average cost of capital would straight away be cut in half.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
that would also be deducted theoretically from our rate already.
That is why of course, that is why we have been arguing that the return of investors in Meralco should be based on their equity rather than on the asset base. Tingnan mo naman, Kamentong. In this particular year, we are being charged 8.7 billion pesos for capital expense. Last year, we were charged 10.3 billion for capital expense. That is just the first 2 years of the third regulatory period.
4-year yung regulatory period.
4-year yung regulatory period na yan. The 10.3 billion last year, the 8.7 billion this year, which is about 20 billion, at the end of the period, is going to be rolled over to the regulatory asset base. Ang mangyayari, Kamentong, pera mo na, ikaw na ang kapital, ikaw ang nag-provide, at the end of the day, when they impute the WACC to the regulatory asset base, sinisingil ka pa ng 14.75% of your own money that was used to build up the asset base.
This is very complex, and I hope the audience follows very carefully, but we will do some summaries para makita nila. But on the question of interest rate alone for their cost of capital, I am familiar with some of the large companies. I have a brother who has a very large company, and as prime accounts, they are charged only 3-4%
Per annum.
per annum.
Yes.
Ito 14.75%.
The
Meralco is not a small operation.
No, the computation of the weighted average cost of capital based on the final determination that was made by the Energy Regulatory Commission in June of 2011, the cost of debt that Meralco is allowed to charge us is anywhere from 10.3% to 13.8%.
That is for the year, because that changes.
That changes.
They put it at 14.75, but on that particular year referring to 13.5 or more.
Yeah, because Kamentong, the cost of money, the cost of debt is only one of several components for the WACC. So as far as the 14.75% total WACC is concerned, that is driven by the 10.3% to 13.8% interest. Now, here is how it relates to the bill deposit. Under the original formulation of the Magna Carta, it said the interest that the utility is going to pay the customer for the deposit is equivalent or aligned with the cost of debt or the interest that is embedded in the weighted average cost of capital. In this case, 10.3% to 13.8%. That is why, for the longest time, and Pete Ilagan has pointed this out consistently, Meralco was paying 10% interest on the bill deposit. However, in November 2010, the Energy Regulatory Commission adopted an amendment to the Magna Carta which totally deleted the reference to the weighted average cost of capital
as a base for the
interest to be paid to us for the bill deposit, and explicitly stated it has to be marked to the land bank rate at the start of the year. In the annual report of Meralco for 2011, it is stated in their notes that for the year 2010, the interest of land bank was 0.75%. For the year 2011, it was 0.5%.
Okay. We have to take our break, but note that, yung dapat 10% ang binabayad sa atin, naging 0.7, not even 1% now.
Not even 1%.
Okay, we'll take this break and more shocking revelations in the second half.